Hello, everyone. My name is Eric Eickhoff, and I serve as the Associate Director of Alumni Relations at John Carroll University. Thank you for joining us for another edition of JCU Junior. Today, we'll hear from Dr. Kristen Ehrhardt, Associate Professor in Classics, who has taught about the lives and stories of the ancient Greeks and Romans in the Mediterranean world at John Carroll since 2011. She earned her doctorate in Classics from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and her BA in Classics and Philosophy from Macalester College in St. Paul, Minnesota. In her research, Dr. E demonstrates how Roman poets used and reimagined earlier Greek and Roman authors' works. As a Greek and Latin professor, she shows the connections between people throughout the ancient world. In her classrooms, she likes to use role-playing games to encourage students to think about history and texts in new ways and to connect these sources to our own lives. Students in her courses read texts by authors from many places and time periods, from Homer to Saint Perpetua, and consider evidence from a wide variety of ancient Mediterranean cultures. In 2018, she won JCU's Lucrezia Kaliki Award for teaching excellence. In this talk, Dr. E is excited to tell you about the Greek and Roman myths that we can find in the stars. We'll also learn about the people who told them and how those stories came down to us. We hope you enjoy it.
Hello! Today I'm going to talk to you about the Greeks and the Romans and the stories they told about the things they saw in the sky. I'm Dr. Ehrhardt, and I teach Greek and Latin literature and about the history and the cultures of the people who lived in the ancient Mediterranean world at John Carroll University. To get started, we should talk briefly about what a constellation is. The word constellation comes from Latin and basically takes the prefix con, which means with or together, and adds it to another word that means star, stella. Pretty straightforward. So a constellation isn't a single star, it's a pattern you get when you put together some stars, like a dot to dot. If you really get into stargazing and astronomy, you'll learn that there are also things called asterisms. Technically, the word asterism comes from the word astrum, which is just another Latin word for star. Asterisms are groups of stars that make a pattern in the sky, which is kinda exactly what I just told you a constellation is. So what's the difference? Most of the named constellations in the Northern Hemisphere, like you see here, were identified in classical antiquity, while asterisms, though not at all new, are patterns used by other groups of people. Western scientists decided to use the constellation names that you see here instead of the asterism names. But as we'll discuss a little bit later, every culture has stared at the stars at night and used the stars to help themselves orient themselves. The background of this slide actually does some of the dot-to-dotting of known constellations for us. So, how can we see constellations? Obviously, you'll need to look up at the sky on a night without clouds, and you'll have a lot better luck if you're in a place that's away from the city lights. But even in my own backyard here in University Heights, I can see some of the constellations. The biggest thing to know is that it's up to you to figure out how you're going to draw the dots together and figure out the shapes. And there are lots of ways to learn more about identifying stars and planets in the sky. I'm not an astronomer, but I can tell you a few basics. So, when I'm in my backyard at night, if I face where I know Lake Erie is, I can almost always figure out where Polaris is. Polaris is also called the North Star, and it stands in basically the same line as the rotational axis of the Earth, above the North Pole. Polaris is one of the brightest stars in the sky, so even in an area with a lot of light pollution, you can usually still find it. I learned about how to find the groups of stars, the asterisms, known as the Little Dipper and the Big Dipper, before I knew anything, really, about Greek or Roman mythology. Polaris stands at the end of the handle of the Little Dipper. Once you find the Little Dipper, you can look around for the Big Dipper. In the summer, the Big Dipper is usually to the left, sort of at the early parts of the evening. All of these constellations move around and across the same spot over the course of the night. They move around Polaris, so they're called circumpolar, going around Polaris. Polaris remains in about the same spot always. Now, the constellations that the dippers come from are called Ursa Major, and Ursa Minor. The Asterisms, the Big Dipper here, is part of Ursa Major. One thing to know is that Ursa is the Latin word for bear, and major means bigger and minor means smaller. So at this point, you're probably wondering, why are there bears in the sky? And maybe you're also wondering who came up with these stories. Now, many cultures throughout time have looked at the sky. As Chanda Prescott Weinstein, a theoretical physicist, wrote earlier this summer, all cultures have looked to the night sky. She says, "From my point of view, the ability to see and study the sky isn't a luxury, but a fundamental part of what liberation looks like. As a species, we evolved under the night sky. Every single community has studied the stars and developed cosmologies, origin stories that explain not just our own universe, but also ourselves. In turn, the stars help us find our way here on the ground. Heroes such as Harriet Tubman are believed to have used constellations to navigate their journeys to freedom. To look at the sky and wonder is a fundamentally human activity. It is a part of who we are." Now, it's a little funny to imagine bears up in the sky, but a lot of people have seen bears up there. Many Native American tribes have many different stories about the big bear in the sky. Likewise, the Big Dipper was used by enslaved people searching for freedom in America via the Underground Railroad. They used it to help orient themselves and find where the North is. It's super useful to be able to figure out where the Polaris/North Star is, because it helps you figure out where you are. If you walk towards Polaris, you're going north. And knowing the relationship of Polaris with the Dipper asterisms helps you know for sure that you're looking at the correct bright star. Basically, understanding where the stars are in the sky allows people to find their way. And stories about how the stars move, not like this though, whoa, is an essential part of that. We remember things better when it's an interesting story. Now, because I studied the world of the Greeks and Romans, I'm going to spend most of my time in this presentation focusing on those stories. Now, I think it's super useful to take a look at a map to get an idea of why knowing the positions of stars would be useful to them. So this is a map of the broader Mediterranean world. The Mediterranean Sea that you see in the middle, which literally means the middle of the earth, connected loads of different people in antiquity. The Greeks got their alphabet from the Phoenicians, who were sailors, and originally from over here on this coast, in what is today Lebanon. But they sailed around and settled everywhere throughout the Mediterranean world. They settled on Sicily and here in North Africa, in what was called Carthage, in Sardinia, in Spain, everywhere. Now, when you're sailing around, you can do it in a couple different ways. You can go along and hug a coast, right? But that's going to take a lot longer than if you can just sail boop, 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 boop through the sea. But how do you know where you're going when you're in the middle of a really fairly large body of water, right? The Mediterranean Sea is a lot bigger than even Lake Erie. And if you've looked at Lake Erie, you know you can't see across the whole thing. Well, if you have stars, you can use those to help yourself navigate. In fact, the word navigation comes from the Latin word for sailing. So if you ever use GPS navigation, you're kind of using something to help you sail. Now, this is a Google map, and I left the modern country names on here so you might have an idea of where these places are now. But there weren't countries or nations in antiquity. There were city-states made up of peoples and regions and colonies, which were a group of people from one city who moved away and maintained ties to their original cities, and allies and trading posts, and things like common languages and religious beliefs and cultural practices were what distinguished people from being understandable or not. That is to say, if you weren't able to be understood through your language, you were a barbarian. The word barbarian in antiquity for both the Greeks and the Romans meant a person who made a bar noise. That is to say, like, you can't understand them. So you can think of the folks who are from Greece as the people who spoke Greek. The earliest bits of the Greek language that we know about, because it was written down, is from the 800s BCE. So like almost 3,000 years ago. Although we think of Greece as a country that's right here, plus like some islands, this box gives you an idea of the people who all considered themselves to be Greek speakers, who all participated in loads of communication and trade. Here's a better view of that box. The Peloponnesis is this area, the big sort of hand glob at the bottom. Important cities that you may have heard of include things like Sparta. This is Sparta. Mycenae, where Agamemnon lived in like mythical historical past. The city of Olympia, which maybe you've heard of from the Olympics, where the Olympics first started in 776 BC. Are all here in the Peloponnesus. Also here is a region called Arcadia, which we'll come to and talk about a little bit more. Moving across, there's a little strip of land here called Corinth, where the city of Corinth is. It's an isthmus and it connects the rest of Greece. Athens is down here. You may have heard recently of Evia. That is this piece of land that's sort of an island, but it is sort of connected to Athens still. You'll see it in some places as listed as Euboea. That is what's on fire right now in Greece. So that's sort of in the news. There are other important cities, of course, as well, like Thebes and Delphi, and then all of these islands called the Cyclades in the Aegean Sea, also Crete. But this whole other coast over here, which is now Turkey, was also inhabited by people who spoke Greek and who had close ties. There were colonies, allies with folks from the other side of Greece. So if you got into a time machine and wound up in 4th century BCE Athens and asked about what Greek people were thinking about stuff, they would have no idea. They would not have identified any large group of people as Greeks. They would have thought, what were the Thebans thinking? What were the Athenians thinking? So basically in antiquity, don't assume that there's a Greece. I'm going to talk about Greeks as sort of generic term for the people, but when I think of Greeks, I think of Greek speakers from all around this particular region. What about those Romans? Again, depending on what point in history you're thinking about, the people called Romans could be the people who lived in the city, or it could be folks across this whole region once Romans start going to war and conquering their neighbors, or once Rome becomes an empire and their neighbors that they conquer become this whole area. That's also a thing. Rome grew up around the same time as a lot of Greek cities, and there was cultural borrowing between those cultures from a very early point. There was pottery that got sent from Athens and used in Rome sort of already in the 6th century BC. Greek and Roman myths, likewise, are really similar. They tell sort of the same stories, though they change the names of the gods and the heroes. And there are always going to be new, different versions of stories happening. But one thing that it's super important to know is that it is okay that ancient myths sometimes have weird overlaps and disjunctions. There is not ever one perfect, pure version of any ancient myth. There are different groups of people coming up with all of their own stories all throughout this ancient world. And then those stories get spread around by poets who sing their songs to different audiences. And maybe you would have been over in another city, you would have heard a song, and you would tell the story to your folks. Remember, there's no TV or internet in the ancient world. These songs about heroes and gods that they already know are their education, their religion, and their entertainment, all wrapped up together. And new stories about them were always welcome, although reruns were also really great too. The myths about stars were part of this ancient song culture. Some of the earliest references to stars in ancient Greek poetry come from the 7th and 6th centuries BC, from around in here, over in Turkey. The person who eventually wrote all these stories down was the astronomer Claudius Ptolemy, who lived in Alexandria, Egypt in the 2nd century CE. So like 800 years after the stories were, started. Ptolemy's knowledge of astronomy was informed not only by earlier Greek scientists, but also Babylonian astronomers. Babylonia is all the way off the map, is where Iraq is now. Ptolemy's classification system of constellations is still part of modern astronomy. Now, I feel like I promised to tell you some stories about bears in the sky. Well, let's start with Ursa Major. That's the constellation that contains the Big Dipper. Oh no! Now, there are two ways that people envision how the lines for Ursa Major go. In one version, as she's been drawn here, she's got a really long tail. And she's got little separated feetsy legs, and she's got a pointy nose down here. But the other version, and you can see the Big Dipper is here and the Big Dipper is here, so this is exactly the same orientation of the Big Dipper. Other people see the stars totally backwards, or see how the bear is oriented backwards. So rather than putting the nose down here, the nose is up in the sky, and she's got a little butt tail down here, and she's got sort of rather more fancier toesies. I don't know what happens to those two stars there. They just kind of get ignored. Either way you draw her, it's worth noticing that this is an Ursa. It's a female bear. So, as the story goes, the big bear is Callisto, though she wasn't always a bear. She was born a nymph, so a sort of a goddess, whose name means most beautiful. Kale means beautiful. That ist at the end gives you a sort of superlative, like best, biggest, prettiest. So Callisto is just prettiest. Callisto lived in Arcadia and was dedicated to the hunter goddess Artemis. She had a child named Arcas. With Zeus, ruler of the gods. But Hera, Zeus's wife, was jealous of this whole thing and turned Callisto into a bear. Callisto roamed around Arcadia for years, separated from her baby, from her child. But one day, 15 years later, Arcas was walking around that same forest as his mom. He had no idea that his mom was a bear. All he knew was he was on a stroll, and now, boom! Big, scary bear in his path. He drew his weapon to kill the bear. It's his mom. And suddenly, Zeus happened to notice what was happening. All of a sudden, Zeus whooshed both Callisto and Arcas up into the sky, where they all live now. Now, who took care of Arcas for all of those years before he nearly killed his mom and got turned into a constellation instead? His grandpa, Callisto's dad, Lycaon, the king of Arcadia. Now, Lycaon doesn't have a constellation, but he's got a really interesting story, and I thought I would tell you that too. Lycaon had 50 sons and a few daughters, like Callisto. Now, there are lots of variations on the story, but according to the Roman poet Ovid, Lycaon got a little arrogant and decided to test how smart Zeus really was. Now, note, it is really bad, a really, really bad idea to test the gods always a bad idea if you're immortal, probably still a bad idea if you're a god, and especially a bad idea if you're trying to test Zeus. But Lycaon goes for it anyway. Zeus always claimed to be all-knowing, and Lycaon thought the best way to check to see if that was really the case was by cooking a human. In some stories, he cooks one of his kids and serves his kid as a part of a sacrifice to Zeus. This is just a lot of really bad decisions on the part of old Lycaon. The gods were not into human sacrifice, and Zeus knew what was going on. And so as a punishment, Zeus, poof, changed Lycaon into a wolf, making this one of the earliest werewolf stories. Haha. So Arcadia's just got some weird families going on it. And really, there's a lot of family drama up in the sky. Let me give you another sort of soap opera constellation. So, Cassiopeia was married to Cepheus, and together they ruled Ethiopia, which the early Greeks thought of as a mythical place in the really far reaches of Africa. Not necessarily where Ethiopia, the country, is now, but still down in Africa and super far away. They also thought of it as a vacation home for the gods. So it had a sort of like fantastical, amazing, mythical placeness to it. So they had a daughter named Andromeda, who's also another constellation who would be kind of over where I am. If you haven't noticed, Cassiopeia really is this constellation. Cepheus really is this constellation. Anyway, Cassiopeia had an issue with vanity. She thought she was all that, and she thought her daughter was even more. In fact, she claimed Andromeda was prettier than Poseidon's daughters, and that was just it. Poseidon was like, nope, and he flooded the whole country, and he sent forward a big, freaky, sea monster named Cetus to torment them. Whoa, terrifying. So Cassiopeia and Cepheus consult an oracle. An oracle is one of those priests who knows what's going on, has direct contact with the gods. And oracles can tell you what to do when things get really terrible. They might not always be right, but it's a good chance that maybe they'll give you some decent advice. So they go to the oracle, and the oracle says they need to sacrifice, that is to say, kill their daughter to make the flood/monster stop. So they chain Andromeda to a rock in the middle of the sea. Remember, the gods don't super love human sacrifice, and as luck would have it, the hero, Perseus, who had just killed the monster Medusa, who is the lady with the snaky hairs who would turn people to stone if they stared directly at her. Perseus just happened to be sailing home from killing Medusa when he noticed Andromeda there in the middle of the sea, chained to a rock. So he stops off, finds Cepheus, offers to kill the freaky Cetus monster if he can take Andromeda home with her. Because remember, she is really pretty. Cepheus agrees, thinks that seems like a perfectly legitimate idea. So Perseus uses his new weapon, Medusa's head, to turn the monster into a stone, and he takes Andromeda home with him. But Poseidon is still super mad about everything that happened and really angry that, like, Andromeda didn't wind up being killed. So he decided that Cassiopeia needed more punishment. So he put her on a throne and turned her into a constellation along with her throne. And so she's always sitting upside down. And it's not a really comfortable chair. Like, it's a sad chair, and she's stuck in the sky. And that's her punishment, to travel around the North Star for all of eternity. She's joined up in the stars with Cepheus, her husband, on presumably a nicer throne. Perseus is here, Andromeda, Cetus is somewhere up here as well. Now, There are loads of little other objects up in the sky too. There are lyres and craters, which are ancient punch bowls, but there's also some hair up in the sky, and I think this is an interesting story, so I was going to tell it to you. The Coma Berenices, which you can kind of see here, it's a constellation that's sometimes apparent. I think it's no longer really apparent. I think it was more out in July. But it sounds like it could be a deep sleep, like a coma, or a thing you use to comb your hair with, which is kind of close. But actually, in Latin, the word coma just means a chunk of hair, like a lock of hair. So why is hair a constellation? So Queen Berenike II was an actual human being, not a mythological character like all these other queens I've been talking about. She lived in for real and ruled for real Egypt in the middle of the 3rd century BCE. This is about 100 years after Alexander the Great had conquered everything and created an entire empire kind of in his name. Her husband Ptolemy III, who's not actually related to Ptolemy the astronomer, went to war. And Berenike was worried about him, so she cut off a chunk of her hair and dedicated it in a temple to the gods. Please, I give you part of my beautiful hair if you guarantee the safe return of my husband, she says. So the next day she goes back to the temple and her hair was gone. An astronomer in the court pointed out the constellation that you see here, said, "Hey, Queen, it's a brand new constellation. It's your hair. The gods are so looking forward to, success for you that they've moved your hair up into the stars. Aphrodite did it." I'm suspecting that you still don't believe me that this is like the coolest thing ever, but believe me, this was a big deal. A poet named Callimachus wrote a long poem about this. Coins were made to commemorate her and this hair loss thing. This was a huge deal. And it was a huge deal because it shows that the gods favor this actual living human family and Berenike's loyalty to the gods in particular. Remember, the other myths I've told you today took place in myth time, not actual time. Myths have a sense of temporality about them, but they are really far removed from the time of the people who told them. None of the Greeks who told or heard the stories of Perseus or Hercules or Medusa thought that those things would really happen to them. They're sort of like the stories of King Arthur and the Round Table. But the story of Berenike's hair is a story about a real human interacting with a divine world that was actually set in their current day. It's a long time ago to us, but it's not to them. It's right then. And that chunk of hair is still in our sky today. And now you know what it's doing there. Now, obviously, I haven't told you all of the stories about the sky, about the stars in the sky here. These are just a few of the constellations you'll see facing north in the summer. If you're interested in learning more about where constellations are in the night sky on any night, you can use the website I took this image from that I've been using as a background. It's the timeanddate.com/astronomy/night. If you Google time and date night sky, you'll get to this. I think it's super nifty. It's a free resource. You can put in a date and pull a cursor across to see what stars are up at what point in night. Thanks for hanging out with me today. I really hope you've learned something new.